Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the regularly scheduled meeting of Ways and Means Committee. John Quincy, the chair, also joined by Council Vice President Glidden, Councilmember Johnson, Councilmember Palmisano, and Yang. We're a quorum of the committee. Councilmember Bender is not able to join us today, as she's attending to some city business out of the city. So let's see what we've got on the agenda today. I know we have two presentations for discussion items towards the end. The remaining 27 items, I'll just read through them really quickly if we could. First is the appointments for the Minneapolis Telecommunications Network Board. Finance and Property Services brings forward 3 items. This is the real estate exchange term sheet. These are some amendments to the downtown office consolidation project, as well as a contract amendment with Perkins and Will, and a contract with Walker Parking Consultants for consulting services for the demolition of the parking structure. Information Technology Department brings forward a contract with Environmental Systems Research Institute. This is for mapping and analyzing assets. This is a software program. We also have an RFP for computer-assisted mass appraisal system. That's replacing that system. The Executive Committee brings forward the appointed position in the Health Department. It's called the Director of Environmental Programs. Community Development Regulatory Services Committee brings forward contracts with Gimmick and Build Wealth Minnesota. Provide some lending services for Home Ownership Opportunity Minneapolis program. We also have a bid for removal of hazardous trees and stumps. The Health, Environment, and Community Engagement Committee brings forward a grant from Clearway, Minnesota to create a smoke-free generation, as well as a memorandum of understanding with Alina Health Systems, and an agreement with Xcel Energy to participate in Renewable Connect program. The Public Safety, Civil Rights, and Emergency Management Committee brings forward the 2017 Urban Scholars Program funding from various partner organizations, as well as a contract with Business Watch International for Police Automated Property System Services, and a contract amendment with Minneapolis Police Department SWAT officers at the U.S. Bank Stadium. We also have a contract with the University of Minnesota Veterinary Medical Center for Police Canine Health Services. Transportation and Public Works Committee brings forward a number of items, including an agreement with Metropolitan Council for 5th Street Light Rail Corridor signal improvements, as well as an agreement with Minnesota Department of Transportation for traffic signal design services. That's associated with the 35W Transit Access Project. We also have an agreement with Minnesota Department of Transportation for 35W and Lake Street Transit Access Project. Agreement with EMA Inc. for project management support for services for Advanced Meter Infrastructure Project. Contract amendment with Fitzgerald Excavating and Trucking, Stormwater Pond Dredging and Cleanout Project. Subordinate funding agreement with Met Council and for Southwest Light Rail Transit Project. The Essex Street Sanitary Sewer Project designation, its cost estimate, appropriation increase, and setting for a public hearing. It's item number 23. Item number 24 is the combining of the 17 and 18 Parkway paving program. That's also a bid for Crane Carrier OEM parts and services, item 25. Item 26 is the bid for 2017 concrete pavement rehab program, as well as a bid for installation of large diameter cured in place pipe. And the final 2 items are going to be on discussion. It's the reopening of the Nicollet Avenue and Lake Street project and a response to a staff direction from the budget cycle last on our banking services program. So we'll take up those 2 items in a moment, and if there's any questions on the previous consent agenda items, not seeing any, I'll move all those. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
And opposed? Those items all carry. Thank you very much for those. And now we get to the first of the discussion items. So if we have, this is on the reopening of Nicollet, and I think we're having Mr. Frank from CPED join us to walk us through this. We're looking at the purchase option for that parcel. So, Mr. Frank, welcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, committee members, council member. As most of you know, the city has been working for years on this effort to reopen Nicollet Avenue at Lake Street. For the past 18 months, after receiving authorization from council to have an option on this piece of property, and spend $800,000 towards that option price of $8 million. We have been negotiating with Sears Kmart to see if there was a deal to be made with them. The good news, I suppose, is there's clarity and there's not a deal to be made at this time with Sears Kmart. That's the bad news. The good news is there's clarity, and staff is recommending that we proceed to exercise our option, spend an additional $7.2 million. We're also asking for $100,000 of authority for some closing costs and acquire that property. That would happen yet this year, and then we would continue to work with Sears Kmart then as our tenant, as the city's tenant, and keep the surrounding community involved as we have been with what will happen there in the future and make sure they understand what's going on. The funding source, relevant to your purview here today, the funding source that we are suggesting for the $7.2 million of purchase price is the streetcar value capture mechanism. That mechanism has collected $7.7 million to date since the City Council put it in place, and we expect to collect an additional $7 million yet this year and more into the future. So CDRS committee concurred with staff recommendation last week. We're here today to inform you of this, seek your approval for this funding source, and then with after answering any questions, seek council approval to exercise the option and become the landowner of this piece of property yet this year. And Mr. Chair, I'm available for questions as you or the committee wishes.
Sure. Thank you very much, Mr. Frank. Obviously, this is a topic of great significance, which is why we brought it forward to have just a little touch point here in this committee. You outlined the funding source and the amount as was the negotiated prices when we took that action up. Was it 1 year ago, 2 years ago?
Mr. Chair, it was November 2015.
15, right. So things continue to progress, but having ownership does kind of prevent that or provide that stability in the process. So I'm very pleased to have it. I just wanted to make sure we're talking about the funding source. And I think you outlined what the value capture district is and what it's performing at in current levels. I think maintaining that instrument is the most important aspect of the streetcar project going forward. Could you care to just elaborate as the state legislature and everything provides that funding structure?
Sure. Mr. Chair, committee members, the streetcar value capture mechanism that the legislature enabled in the session preceding the council's action to put it in place allowed for a very narrow range of uses for the money that we have been collecting. Among those uses is acquisition of right-of-way for the streetcar project, which is why staff recommends using it in this case, and just in this case, to acquire this piece of property, which is, of course, the right-of-way where Nicollet will be in the future. You touched on it, Mr. Chair, so I'll just go into a little bit more detail. The value capture mechanism takes the property taxes collected from 5 blocks along the Nicollet Central streetcar line and makes them available in a fund to spend on eligible costs. And I mentioned that one of those eligible costs is land acquisition for streetcar right-of-way. So that's one of the things we can do with it.
When the previous committee took this topic up, there was also a staff direction attached to it. Councilmember Reich brought it forward. It was really important, I think, especially from a Ways and Means perspective, is to find out the original source of the money when we go and we want to memorialize those sources and we want to recover those in future sales. Could you outline that real quickly?
Absolutely, Mr. Chair. So at CDRS committee, there were several staff directions. One of them was from Councilmember Reich, who said, and I'm paraphrasing here, at such time in the future as the city has complete control of the site, in the absence of the Kmart lease, and we have the right-of-way available to us to construct Nicollet, the remainder of the property will be sold for development after some community engagement about what are the goals and objectives there. And as such time as we sell those properties, the land sales proceeds will be redeposited, if that's the right word, into the streetcar value capture fund.
I just wanted to memorialize that, we've had that previously. If you remember, Councilmember Palmisano, we sold a public works facility, and where that money goes, does it go back into the general fund? Does it go into a development account? That was always the question. We had some forensic accounting, had to find out where that originally went, and that we made sure it stayed in that original source. So putting that staff direction in assures that we don't have this argument in 20, 30 years where that money goes back to.
Or sooner, Mr. Chair.
Or much sooner, we hope. Thank you. Are there other questions or comments on this particular project or item? Not seeing any. Thank you very much, Mr. Frank.
Thank you.
I'd like to go ahead and move approval of discussion item number 28 on the agenda. Any questions? Not seeing any. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
And opposed? Thank you. That item carries. Now to the next item, Mr. Ruff. This is a response to the staff direction on our banking services contracts.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I'm Mark Ruff, the city's Chief Financial Officer. So I want to thank you in advance for your patience. This is going to be a longer than typical presentation, and I think it's appropriate given the breadth of the conversation that revolves around issues of banking for the city. How we move our money, how we use our money is very important. And Councilmember Cano, who's with us today, as well as Councilmember Gordon, brought forth the staff direction in December, which asked us to look at our banking practices in light of a couple of social issues, specifically the fossil fuel industry and the Dakota Access Pipeline, as well as looking at a municipal bank operation. And so we have taken this discussion and used this as an opportunity to broaden then this perspective of what is really banking services within the context of the city of Minneapolis. And so I just want to, first of all, thank the council for these 6 months to actually be thoughtful about this process and not require us to do this in a matter of a few weeks. It was very helpful for me, being relatively new to the city, to be able to explore this issue, have some conversations with other jurisdictions, as well as with the public and policymakers. I think it was a better process because of that time. First of all, I just want to explain what our relationships are in banking, and just at a very basic level, we pay a fair amount of fees, something over $2 million a year, for banking services in a variety of ways. Those are things like doing payroll, but more importantly, we borrow money. We also lend money. We have as a regular process for all of our contracts a request for proposal, or what we refer to as in this document an RFP process. And in the past, when it comes to banking, we've been concerned about several things. One of them being, and this is a big issue in the last couple of years, data security. We also obviously want to choose a vendor who is the lowest cost. But just as importantly, I think, is also the breadth of services that we are able to utilize from a vendor, as well as are they available locally. There's always issues, even though this is an electronic world, of having access to people. It's important to note, I think, that for many of us, we think of banks as just being plug and play. And by that, I mean that we can take one bank that can do the exact services at another bank, and so we have a wide variety of choices. I would submit to you that that is not the case in today's world. There are many banks who are better at some services than other banks, and that's the advantage of our RFP process, is to be able to identify what those strengths and weaknesses are and make the best choice for the city of Minneapolis. It's also fair to say that banking evolves. We are, first of all, I would say Minneapolis has become a high maintenance client. We are a very complex organization. And at the same time, banks evolve, and it's very common to have acquisitions. I'll use an example is that we had in our investment, for our investment portfolio, an investment manager who was a women-owned business, and they were acquired by a larger entity, and we are working with that larger entity for the investments right now. Technology certainly has played a role in terms of the banking world. It's reduced our costs. We probably have $1 million less in staff costs than we did 8 years ago, just for processing our regular transactions. So that has been a benefit to us. but it also causes increased expectations in terms of how quickly we can resolve issues with some of our customers. The last thing I would say just about some of the social issues around banking, that's evolved. And this is nothing new. Certainly you go back a long time. We look back in the early 1900s, and large banks were a concern in the early 1900s. And if those of you who maybe like me had a lot of history classes over the years, learned about people like William Jennings Bryan and others who were very much instrumental in some of the progressive movement in the early 1900s. Some of those changes that occurred in 1930s because of bank failures. 1980s, we had small family-owned farms that were in crisis, and banking issues were clearly a part of that as well. And then the mid-2000s and late 2000s in terms of the housing crisis. So, those issues continue to evolve over a period of time. Certainly the city did address this a few years ago in 2013 for the Responsible Banking Ordinance. And we're going to talk a little bit about that at the end of this presentation, but certainly if the council wants to highlight that, I know Councilmember Quincy was very involved with the adoption, as well as Councilmember Glidden, of the Responsible Banking Ordinance. So that's just, again, broaden the perspective of when we talk about banking relationships and set some of the stage for this particular discussion. What did we do specifically in the last 6 months? Well, we've learned from a fair number of other cities. The city of St. Paul right now is in a regular cycle of a 5-year RFP process, and we've been talking with the staff there. At the council's suggestion, we've been talking to the city of Santa Fe, who's been looking at a municipal bank operation and study only, as well as the cities of Seattle and New York City in terms of what they've been doing with some of their depository banking work. The other part of this is working with the city attorney and just talking about what state law boundaries do we have. And from a legal perspective, how is a city really different than a consumer or than a regulator? And I think this is part of the uncertainty in this conversation. So I look at it from the perspective that I, as an individual, can be very arbitrary in my decisions as a consumer. I can choose places I want to visit, use, what firms I want to use or not use. And that arbitrary approach is very easy for me as a consumer to adopt. As a city, we don't have that same flexibility. We have some boundaries that we have to live with in state law, within what case law is for cities as well. I think that sometimes it's also important that we'll talk a little bit later about this 2015 U.S. District Court case. Is that on one hand we have cities who what appears to be more arbitrary across the country saying we're not going to use this particular bank anymore because of reason X, Y, and Z. But there is another side of this, and I think it's important for the public to be aware that there has been some pushback from banks in different parts of the country. So in 2015, the New York Bankers Association did sue the city of New York City over their equivalent of a responsible banking ordinance. They call it Responsible Banking Act. It was broader than our responsible banking ordinance, but they did take that to U.S. District Court, and the Bankers Association won. In other words, threw out the city's responsible banking ordinance. So again, there are boundaries. It's not to say that was right or wrong. It's just that there are boundaries of which we have to live within. And one of the things that comes out of that court case is when we're not the regulator. So I'll use, again, a local example. We are the regulator when it comes to things like liquor stores and when they can be open and closed. Okay? We are not, by, at least I understand it, by law, able to punish financial institutions arbitrarily. Okay? And even we can't do it for liquor stores because we have a final set of guidelines. And so we have to keep that in mind when we look at how we behave as a city and how we set the stage for whatever particular actions we want to take. And again, this is not trying to take away any power from the city. It's just to say that part of our job as staff is to acknowledge that there are places where it's riskier for the city to venture when there are opportunities for legal action. And what I would say is also an explanation to the public in terms of how we can be the most effective as a city at trying to accomplish our goals. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. In particular, the last issue is just forecasting if-then. Right? So if we are to take a particular action, what does that mean for us economically? And one of the things that it means is generally is if we exclude certain partners within banking, it's likely then to constrict the number of people we can work with, and there are costs associated with that. There are also costs in the fact that we have a whole lot of customers, whether they're utility payers or taxpayers, who rely on us and interface with us through the banking world. And so what is the measure of inconvenience and or confusion for those customers? Because it is a big deal to change some of these banking relationships in today's world, given how tied we are, especially through IT improvements. So that's a general background. Definitions of banking, more specifically, what are the areas we're going to cover today? Number 1 is depository banking. 2 is investments and related services. 3 is debt issuance. 4 is really our credit card processing. 5th is our lending practices, where we as a city do act as a bank. And the last 2 being underwriting and servicing of those loans, and then whatever trust relationships we have specifically within our health reimbursement account.
Excuse me, Mr. Ruff.
Sure.
Before we go into the meat of this, I want to appreciate the outline and the definitions that you've just provided. Just want to make sure everybody was acknowledged that we've been joined by Council Members Gordon and Cano. So thanks for joining us. And as we get to these sections, would you prefer if there's any questions at the end of each of these sections, or do you want to wait for longer? It's up to you, of course, but.
You know, Mr. Chair, if I can, I'd rather get through the whole conversation and then open it up for questions, just because I think toward the end will be more of the options and action items, and I think that this is really all background leading up to those options.
I think that's very helpful. I just wanted to check in before we launched in. So thank you. Please continue.
All right. So the city's depository banking account, this is really our checking account. This is where money comes in and moves out. It doesn't stay very long in this account, just like hopefully most of us who have a checking account are earning a very much an interest on these types of accounts, so we try not to keep that money there a long time. But it's really the critical area of how the money moves. And I did hand out a chart that I think helps at least explain why we're a high maintenance client, and certainly if it wants to go up on the board, we can put it up on the board as well. But this is just a chart that explains the complexity of money coming in, because it's not just about the city itself. We also involve the park board. We also, this is a chart from our last request for proposals for banking services. And it was attempt to explain to vendors then how the money comes in and moves out. We have lock boxes. We have a variety of very technical uses of money, ACHs, which is automatic cash withdrawal that we use on a regular basis. So this document, which was put together by Larry Parker, and Larry is our banking manager, is with us today. So certainly if there are any questions about how we move money through our system, Larry is the expert. He's very able, very capable, and has been with the city for a number of years. I rely on him heavily. So that's just to give you a little sense of the banking relationship that we have internally. We did, as I mentioned, undertake a request for proposals in 2014, and we had 3 responses. That was U.S. Bank, BMO Harris, and Wells Fargo. The difference in fees, we selected Wells Fargo. They were $70,000 lower than any other vendor. In fact, they were also not just on the basis of fees, but also on the basis of performance rated the top firm. And I will tell you that since our experience in the RFP process, we've not been disappointed with the promises that Wells Fargo made. They have been very good to work with. They are very responsive to Larry's many inquiries, and he can tell you how many times, oftentimes per day, he's talking to their staff. So I would just say on a performance basis, certainly one of the evaluations is, and one of the reasons we have a shorter 3-year period and then 2 longer optional periods, is if the vendor is not performing, we want to move out of that relationship as quickly as possible. In this case, the vendor is performing really above expectations. This relationship, I should mention, is based on not just flat fees per year and per month, actually, but really in the RFP, again, I don't expect anyone to read this, but in the RFP are really 4 pages of delineated transactions that we have as a city, just because it's hard to introduce humor into this particular presentation. I will turn your attention to the very last line item, which I warned Larry I was going to bring up. We do have 2 deposited checks per year that go to the Cayman Islands. So They are not my personal checks. They are not, I don't think of Chair Quincy.
You think?
We think. When we deal with the convention center, there's all sorts of adventures we get into banking with the convention center, so I don't think I have to say anything more than that. But I would say that the costs per month really vary by transaction. And so this document is just to give you a sense of what are the types of transactions and the variety of transactions that the city undertakes on a monthly basis. The other important factor, I think, to discuss about why did we only get 3 bids in 2015, since there are so many banks across this metropolitan area. And one of the reasons is a state law on collateralization, where it sounds very esoteric, but it's actually pretty simple, which is the state put into, and this is in Chapter 118A, put into law for all cities, not just Minneapolis, but all cities, counties, townships, a requirement that anytime they put money on deposit that is above the $250,000 FDIC insurance that we all get on our personal accounts, that in order to protect the city from that bank essentially going out of business in one particular day, a bank has to put collateral equal to 110% of that deposit. So that if that bank went out of business, money would be on hand as security, collateral, basically, that we could then take. And that collateral is not in the form of home mortgages or anything like that. By state law, it's a very limited set of instruments. Primarily, many banks use treasuries, U.S. treasuries, or they will use lines of credit to help secure that. So, just as an example, if I am the city of Minneapolis and I'm moving $140 million into my account, because that's what our wire transfer from the county is going to be for our property tax settlement, I may have that money in our account, hopefully only for a few hours, but it might be for a few days. So for that period of 2 days, the vendor needs to have essentially $160 million of treasuries available, or a line of credit available for 2 days. That's a very arduous task for a small bank to be able to assemble that kind of credit or collateral, have it available, and then have it go away. And I know in working with cities, and certainly Lori Johnson, our deputy CFO, can tell you from personal experience, even for smaller cities, this can be a struggle with banks, because it's just a lot of work for banks to have to gear up for that type of short-term transaction. Because as I said, we don't want to leave the money in that account for a very long period of time. So that's primarily why we end up working with larger banks, is both this collateralization issue and then also just the complexity of the transactions that we've been discussing. Do I feel good about the fact that we only have 3 bidders on these types of contracts? No, I'd love to see a great deal more. Certainly we could try to attract banks from across the country for this type of work, but when they don't have a local branch, it makes it more difficult for us to process deposits and all of the other things that come along with our varied, cash and checking relationships that we have with our banks. Okay. So, and again, I just want to remark that if we change depository banks, it is a burden upon customers. I mean, we make it convenient for people to pay on a variety of ways, and any disruption in that means, again, as I said, it's not just people who are, it's not just the payroll, it's really this more of the utility billing side of this that enters into the complexity. Right? So I spent a little more time than what I will on the rest of these, but really the main reason is because there's a lot of focus on the depository bank when you certainly have heard about these other cities who have worked with Wells Fargo and have said we're not going to work any longer, Seattle being one of them. This is the main area, and you hear conversations about, well, it's $1 billion of transactions. Well, in reality, it's not that much money that sits in there in that account, and the bank doesn't really make much, if any, interest earnings on that. The primary compensation they get for that is the fees, and again, that's approximately $269,000 per year. Okay. I will also say that you may have heard in the news that New York City was contemplating changing banks, but if you go and look at the Banking Commission in New York City, I think Wells Fargo undertakes their work for them as well, and it was partly on the basis of the CRA rating that had dropped that they had talked about changing the banks, but if you look and see in the Banking Commission, Because of this difficulty in changing, they actually left Wells Fargo's contract in place, as well as the fact that Seattle is taking over a year to transition some of that work. So moving on, we actually pay substantially more in fees for another service, and that's $586,000 a year for helping us invest our cash. Okay? So we get money from this relationship. The money we get is investments that we make according to state law. Again, what we can invest in as a city is pretty limited. We don't invest in equities. We invest in treasuries, mortgage-backed securities, very plain vanilla transactions for the most part. We have 4 vendors. We did an RFP in 2014. This is an area where there's a fair amount of competitiveness. We had 19 responses. And the fee spreads were over $100,000. In other words, there were a big range of from top to bottom how much people would charge us for this particular service. Really, 3 of the vendors, PFM, which is not technically a bank, it is a corporation, but Galliard and RBC, which is Royal Bank of Canada, are our main core investment managers. And then we have Advanus, which is our more day-to-day variable investments. Okay. Again, this is a 3-year contract through the end of 2017 with 2 one-year extensions. This is an area where we see there could be some changes, and I'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of our relationship, mainly from a business practice and as the market changes. And I think that's one of the other advantages of having changes every 5 years is that not only do institutions change, but actually the market does change, and how we respond to the market is important as well. I'm going to quickly move through some of these other relationships just because, and certainly at the end, if you have questions about them, let me know. The next is a custodial relationship, where essentially, in order to function as a larger entity in today's electronic world, money doesn't move by check, and we don't clip coupons on bonds we may hold of another jurisdiction. We move all the money electronically, and we have to have a custodian for that relationship. Again, Wells Fargo is our custodian for those particular transactions. It's about $38,000 per year in fees, and that contract runs the same term as our depository relationship. And we are considering, just for business practices, of breaking out that from our depository relationship. The next area is just a description of how the city acts as a bank itself, and this is tied to the municipal banking discussion in the staff direction. So both NRP Loans, Neighborhood Revitalization Program, for those not familiar with that, and CPED, our Community Planning and Economic Development Department, issues loans to individuals, and sometimes we partner with banks. And then in many cases, we issue bonds and then turn around and reloan that money. And we have 3 particular programs in which that's undertaken. So those CPED bank participation loans, that commonly around the city referred to as 2% loans, but there's other subcategories that are utilized for that program. We have about 240 loans outstanding for a principal balance of $6.6 million. We don't undertake any payment of fees, nor do we receive any real revenues from that. We are just simply partnering with the bank and sharing the risk with the bank for a particular business loan. This is, again, small print, but this gives you a sense of all of the banks that we've worked with on this particular program over its life. Other CPED loans, oftentimes around the city referred to as Loan C. These are mostly for housing, but also for economic development purposes. We have 795 loans outstanding at $256 million. Many of these are for affordable housing projects. We may never see this money come back. They're forgivable loans in some cases, depending on performance. Those loans are originated, meaning that all the paperwork in terms of the applications are done through vendors, Greater Metropolitan Housing Corporation, or GIMIC, and then Build Wealth. Those loans are primarily for home improvement and mortgage assistance, so individuals. There's about 813 loans and 8.6 million outstanding. We pay approximately $100,000 for that banking relationship with those entities. The contract expires the end of this year. We also have servicing done, so when people pay back those loans over a long period of time, we hired a third party, and that's Community Reinvestment Fund. It was a CDFI, and we pay them about $15,000 a year for that service. NRP Loans, we have over 1,000 NRP loans, $15.8 million outstanding balance. Those are originated by a variety of vendors. and several hundred of them, again, over 1,000, several hundred of them through Energy and Center for Energy and Environment. So obviously from that explanation, many of these are not just remodeling, but also energy and efficiency loans. We pay approximately $186,000 per year for the origination and servicing of those loans. So again, a pretty substantial payment for these banking services that we outsource as a city. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about bond issues moving on, but the Common Bond Fund, which we have talked briefly with the council in the last couple of years as a source of funding for some other programs in the city. This is one area where we actually do make a little bit of money as the city. This is a loan program primarily for larger businesses, medium to larger businesses. It's a real estate loan program. It's primarily for employment improvements, but oftentimes has been used in the past for also redevelopment. We have an indirect guarantee for that through a reserve and then a limited levy pledge. We have two banking vendors. One is Piper Jaffray and the other is Royal Bank of Canada, RBC. The next bond issue, we only do these types of bonds every few years, sometimes as long as 5 years separating the transactions. We have one pending that's about $270,000 in fees for that particular transaction. We are at the time where we have to do we are in fact past the 5-year period for an RFP, so we will be undertaking an RFP for this particular service. But again, the debt service is not paid by the city, it's paid by the borrower, the business, but because we credit enhance it or essentially co-sign those loans, we have a significant involvement in them. The other area where we borrow money more regularly is just through our regular city general obligation, or sometimes we refer to them as net debt bonds. So once or twice a year, we come before you with capital needs. These are for our road improvements or new buildings or remodeling of buildings. We issue bonds on behalf of the park board, and so they might be for some of those activities as well. And so if you recall, we just earlier this year did $80 million issues, two $40 million issues, which were broken into a taxable and a tax exempt piece. The total fees for that transaction were $330,000. We don't award the bonds on the basis of lowest fees. We actually award the bonds on the basis of a combined lowest fees and interest rates. And Baird was the particular winner in that transaction. We don't have a long-term relationship with any of these folks. It's just like any construction bid. We just put it out for bid and take the best rate, and then most of the time those investment banks turn around and resell to the public or to insurance companies or other banks around the country. But this is a part of our banking business, and how we behave, and again, is very much dictated by especially federal regulations and also state law. As a city, we have embarked on several larger construction projects, Nicollet Mall and Target Center specifically. So rather than issue long-term debt right away where we pay a lot of interest and don't earn as much interest in our accounts as those construction projects are built over a 1 or 2 or 3 year period, then we'll do a bank loan, which again is a general obligation pledge from us for these bond issues, but the loan will be short-term. And in fact, for Target Center, we drew money out on this loan, and then just as a part of that $80 million issue that I mentioned earlier, we refinanced that bank loan into a longer-term debt. We do an RFP process again, and we have utilized Wells Fargo and U.S. Bank for those particular bank loans. There are no fees directly paid to the banks, but they do get an interest rate spread. We can't quantify exactly how much money they are making, but it is a dollar amount certainly that is measurable. But again, they have been the lowest cost overall. And we have tried to vary some of the interest rate basis, really getting into the weeds here, but one is tied to a LIBOR rate, the other is tied to a SIFMA rate. And so we try to just provide, part of the reason we do this, and we also do this for the parking fund a little longer term than just the short-term construction projects, is, again, we are a large entity. We have more than $600 million in outstanding debt when you add up the GO bonds and these bank loans. And we try to keep under 25% of that in variable rate. And because interest rates have been so low over the last several years, that's actually saved money, and certainly Mike Ablin, our debt manager, is very capably overseeing that particular program. We also have a bond trustee. This is a particularly obscure type of banking service because it is one where the trustee actually works as a fiduciary on behalf of bond holders if there were ever a problem with paying bonds. In a general obligation bond, we promise to pay no matter what. A revenue bond is based more on just the security behind the assets. We have tax increment revenue bonds, and we also have the common bond fund. And so these trustees tend to be large banks because there are state law requirements about what kind of assets a bank has to have on hand in order to qualify under state law. And it's difficult to change because of that fiduciary responsibility. So we don't do an RFP for these services. We just simply choose them at the time of a bond issuance. There's about $40,000 a year in fees that is paid. And again, these are paid either by TIF revenues or by a business, not by the city. But again, part of our banking relationships. Another large contract is a contract related to our credit card processing. These are not all the fees that are paid as a credit card processing, because certainly the credit card companies take a chunk of the fees, but our vendor is U.S. Bank. They were selected again through an RFP in late 2014, early 2015. There were a healthy number, if I recall, 9 responses for that particular RFP. The fee spread was within $25,000 for the top 3 vendors, but also then over $100,000 for the remainder. This contract expires in 2018 for the 3-year period and then 1 year after that. Again, I would say that staff tells me that we are very happy with the work that U.S. Bank is doing and feel like that we have seen benefit from that relationship. The last banking relationship is related to the fact that the city helps fund partially some of health costs for employees. That money sits in a trust that is administered actually by our Human Resources Department. It's invested by U.S. Bank. Essentially, it's money that sits in the account until somebody uses it, and because we have enough employees, we have a $25 million average balance. So the fees on that are about $20,000 to $30,000 per year. So thank you for bearing with me on that longer discussion, but as I said, it adds up to just over $2 million worth of fees. Again, from year to year, it'll vary primarily by how much we do in bond issues. Okay, so let's turn maybe to a little more of the meat of the issue on the staff direction. I want to talk just first about the municipal bank option. It's really staff's conclusion that a city municipal bank that takes public deposits is really not feasible at this time. And there are several reasons for that. One is, at a basic level, we as a city don't have independent authority to undertake the creation of a bank. We would have to seek special legislation or general law for cities across the state from the state legislature. And even then, we're not guaranteed regulatory approval. We could charter either as a state or a national bank, but there is a process involved in applying for that process. Taking deposits from the public is usually what the state banking commissioner has told us is a requirement of that. In other words, we have to open a branch. That just any banking relationship takes an enormous amount of upfront investment in capital and personnel, technology, specialized expertise, and there's no guarantee that we can actually show a return on that investment. In other words, I think one of the fundamental questions we as a city would have to ask ourselves if we were to undertake this is why. I mean, are we trying to do this to make money? Are we trying to provide better services? And if it is providing better services, then what additional expenditures are we as a city willing to take on in order to provide that service? And particularly when we're in the city of Minneapolis, which is a highly competitive environment. Just as a sidelight, the only state bank that remains is the Bank of North Dakota. And just doing a little more research on that I had forgotten, I have have to apologize to my history professor, that the U.S. government actually had a national bank. This is another attempt at levity. My question to you all is, do you remember who was the sponsor or chief advocate for the national bank back in the 1790s?
Hamilton.
That's right. The man made famous again by a very popular musical. Alexander Hamilton was the one who sponsored the original charter of a national bank. After that national bank charter was withdrawn by Congress in the early 1800s, several states across the nation actually created state banks. And in fact, in 1900, there were still 2 of those operating across the country, state banks. Those 2 no longer exist, but the Bank of North Dakota was created in 1919. And if you go on the Bank of North Dakota's website, you will see that one of the reasons they created this bank was because large banks out of Minneapolis and Chicago were charging farmers 12% interest rate. So there was obviously a competitive need in the state at the time to provide access to capital that did not exist within that particular location. So certainly the Bank of North Dakota, even as long as it's been around, I think only has 1 branch outstanding. It is primarily a lender to commercial entities or a secondary lender, but they have several other functions that, they have a great website if you want to spend some time looking at it. But I would submit to you that we already have elements of public banking within the city that could be expanded if we identify a particular need. And again, I think all of you know me well enough to know I'm not afraid of a challenge if it's for a good reason. And in fact, I was involved when I worked at a consulting firm in creating the first limited trust bank in the state of Minnesota for a particular very narrow focus within the public finance world. And that entity still exists and competes directly with some of these larger banks. It's for a paying agent service. And so I think there are clearly times where if we have needs within the city, we go to the legislature for specific needs. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit more is what do we do already and what are the potential needs or gaps in the private market that we could fill through some of these activities. So as we've talked about, the city is a lender already. And out of this list of areas, I'll just use one specific example, is a housing improvement area. And this is an area where the state has granted cities authority that didn't exist 20 years ago. And specifically the need that rose, and the city of Hopkins was actually the first city to undertake this through special law, was townhome and condo associations who had bad collection rates on their association fees. So there is not a secure mechanism if someone owns a condo or a townhome. There's not a secure mechanism for that townhome association to force people to pay. Or sometimes it's sporadic, depending on how their association is set up and depending on how hard they want to pursue by credit agencies and such some of the collection of these fees. So when you don't have a strong collection of fees, you can't go to a bank then and borrow money. And because if you have a high delinquency rate, the bank is going to only lend you maybe 50% of whatever the costs are of a particular improvement. And for a lot of these condo and townhome associations, these improvements are things like heating and air conditioning systems, their garages, their windows. They're very essential to the infrastructure of those buildings. Hopkins recognized this based on some larger townhome associations and found a way to essentially create a special assessment process to require payment of those association fees on your property tax bill. So hence, those townhome associations that maybe had 50% or 30% delinquency all of a sudden went to 1% because people had to pay their property taxes. So, and on top of it, the city lent those associations money, oftentimes, not always, issued bonds so that they could get the costs of those improvements at a much lower interest rate than maybe the 6 or 7% at that time that they'd be paying. So as you are aware, the city of Minneapolis has undertaken one of these housing improvement areas, has 3 more in the pipeline, I think one very near term. And experience of not only Hopkins, but several other dozen cities that have been around the state of Minnesota that have worked on this is collection rates are very high and default rates are very minimal. So that's clearly an area where a city steps in a municipal banking operation and says, how can I make people's lives better because of the gap in the private market? Okay? Even when you think about our street special assessments, we're giving people a choice. You don't have to pay in cash. You can essentially finance the cost of this reconstructed street through the city. So we give them that choice, and that's against state statute for all cities. Right? On top of it, the state does have a public banking operation, and we participate pretty highly. We borrowed $70 million over this past several years, and we hope to borrow $50 million more through the Public Facilities Authority. That is money that is through a federal program that helps write down the interest rates to cities so we can keep our water user fees low. That interest rate oftentimes is as low as 1 or 1.25% for those loans. So certainly the state has some involvement in lending to other governmental entities, and that's the primary one that I'm aware of. Okay. So we've also, as I mentioned, Councilmember Gordon was kind enough to pass along Santa Fe's, the city of Santa Fe, New Mexico's feasibility study for a municipal bank. I'm not aware of any city across the nation that has undertaken a municipal bank. Santa Fe at least has gone to the point of doing a feasibility study. And one of the main emphasis in their phase 1 of moving into municipal bank that these consultants recommended for the city was for the city just to lend itself more money. And we've started to do that. We could probably do that some more. In other words, what we've done, if you recall, in the last year is when we have a older bond issue that has fairly high interest rates, instead of issuing new bonds and paying more fees, we actually just, because they're short term, 5, 6, 7 years, we can save more money by just taking that money out of our cash reserves and paying ourselves an interest rate that's better than what is our investment rate, but lower than what our borrowing rate is. And essentially, Santa Fe has recommended to consider the same type of approach on a much broader basis. As you recall, the city has also undertaken some direct purchase, or at least set up the ability to do direct purchase of Freddie Mac mortgage-backed securities for naturally occurring affordable housing projects, and we are close to finalizing an agreement with Freddie Mac on this. This is it's a municipal banking operation from the standpoint that we are directly buying rather than using a vendor to buy mortgage-backed securities for, again, a broader goal of the cities, which is to help keep soaring rental costs from pricing people out of the market in certain buildings. The last thing certainly for the city to consider would be just more support of nonprofits, those who are trying to help on payday lending for people who have not a great credit history, and trying to create some more strong credit scores for particular residents. So instead of trying to provide some of those services ourselves, certainly to support those entities that undertake that work as well. The fossil fuel industry is mentioned in the staff report, and I think it's clear we as a city are taking actions to try to minimize our use of fossil fuels. This is at a very basic level, a moral issue, but it's also an economic issue. And let me talk more specifically about that other than these 3 bullet points. One is, we are not aware of a third-party measurement of any banking institutions, or even, quite frankly, any larger vendors' measurement of what constitutes support of fossil fuels. Certainly was mentioned the Dakota Access Pipeline. Certainly Line 3 is the most recent of a larger petroleum pipeline that is a concern for many people, and I sympathize with those concerns in terms of the health of our water resources, not just in tribal lands, but in all lands across Minnesota, and I think all of us are particularly sensitive about that issue. I think to accomplish a definition of fossil fuels would require us to undertake that ourselves, and whether we isolate that to pipelines or not is really a choice of the council to consider. But I would suggest a couple of things. One is, I know that U.S. Bank has come forward and they have an environmental policy that says we're not going to directly lend on pipeline projects. That doesn't mean that they're not lending for the companies who work in fossil fuels. It just means that they are making a statement that says we're not going to lend on larger pipeline projects. So the council would have to consider whether that's enough of a differentiation to actually change behavior. But I would submit to you that I think a larger policy consideration is not just to look at the banking relationships, number one, but to look at all vendor relationships. Because as I mentioned, $250,000 a year is not a substantial amount for a depository banking relationship. And the question is on a supply side, and let me just use these terms and define them, whether that's meaningful rather than us improving our demand side. Okay? So supply side means, do we think that this is going to make a market change on the issue at hand, which is how much petroleum resources are used by the country and frankly the city, by motivating vendors, or is it really more to apply it on the demand side, meaning how can we as a city focus our energy and our resources on reducing the amount of fossil fuels that we use? And certainly the action that you had in front of you today as a committee speaks to the work that we are starting to do, but have a lot of work to do, which is our Renewable Connect program with Excel Energy, which is to move more of our use of electricity to non-fossil fuel based and non-nuclear based electricity. We have a current staff direction we're working on moving, thanks to Councilmember Andrew Johnson, the electrification of our fleet of vehicles, and that certainly would make a substantial impact on our use of fossil fuels as well. And so I would say that given the fact that I have been involved in finance, pipeline projects will find financing one way or the other. And we can certainly make it a little more difficult to them by restricting who our vendors are, but I would suggest that a better use of our resources, just from purely an economic issue, and again, staying away from the moral issue, but from an economic issue, we are better focused on how we use those particular resources or how we move ourselves away from that in terms of the example that we set and the actual motivation that we provide for our vendors. That's not to say that we shouldn't have a dual track with some relationship with vendors, but again, singling out banks, I think, is a consideration that we have to think about, not just from a legal standpoint, but also from just a larger relationship with all of our procurement process. All right. So, last part, almost done. Framework for options. Staff direction asks for those, and it asks in specific how we can stop doing business with certain firms. If you remember, Seattle moved away from working with Wells Fargo, and as I read that ordinance that they passed, it was done on the basis of what they called fair business practices. And so they highlight the Dakota Access Pipeline, they highlight the fines and that have been attributed to Wells Fargo based on the created accounts, and use that as a rationale to say not only are we going to stop doing work as soon as possible, but we would prohibit that particular firm from re-engaging with the city in the near term. I've been talking with the city attorney, and I think we would find difficulty as a city in following Seattle's role. And that is because it, number one, singles out a particular vendor, and number two is because we haven't set up an expectation list for a vendor and then had them follow it. In other words, it moves maybe too far toward that punishment side of the equation and less about the incentive and expectation side of the equation. So there is a legal perspective that we can certainly have a conversation about. But I would also say that we should think about, if we want to just focus these activities around banking, we should really think about our responsible banking ordinance as a whole. Because right now, what we've set expectations for our banking relationships, and again, out of that long list that I went through, we only have 4 of the firms responding to a responsible banking ordinance. It's only our depository relationships and our investment relationship where there's any response. So the first question would be, should we broaden that? And I think the question for the council as a subtext to that is there's a regulatory burden that comes along with having to fill out that paperwork, so that it may keep smaller banks from wanting to work with us because of the work that they have to do on providing that responsible banking ordinance information. It's not just something simply they move off of their website onto our information. It revolves around how much in loans they have for smaller, mid-sized businesses. It revolves around mortgage lending practices, around branch practices. So I would say that we would need a larger discussion about the responsible banking ordinance, and in the context of, does that affect the willingness of a smaller bank given some of the complexity and the high maintenance client that we are, to continue to want to bid for the city. So what are the options that we as staff have provided? There's really three. One, option A is to choose banks based on what we've done in the past, which is to look at just lowest cost. How do we keep property taxes low? The breadth of those services in our current responsible banking ordinance lens. The second option is to choose larger contracts based on those factors in option A. And when feasible, similar to what we've done with the target market program, break those apart. Or option C, certainly council could ask staff to do this, which is to rebid all the contracts as soon as possible. So let's talk and break those down a little more distinctly. First of all, option A, I would say, as I said earlier, for depository relationships, for some of the other relationships, I'm concerned about not having a great deal of competition, particularly for those depository relationships. And I would like to be able to see a way of building up more competition. In particular, that would require some state law change or some work with the government finance officers or the Bankers Association to find a way around this collateralization issue, as well as being able to work on some of the complexity of our transactions and see whether we can work with smaller banks who can team together or work more specifically on some of those endeavors. But that's really option A. It's really, I think, business as usual with trying to build up more competition. The option B, again, leaving most of the contracts in place for 5 years, but to break apart some of the smaller contracts or break apart some of the larger into smaller contracts. In two areas, particular investments and underwriting, we do see some opportunities for working with firms that are either women and minority-owned businesses or to be able to broaden the number of firms that we work with. In particular, I mentioned the market is changing. Just restricting ourselves to 4 firms we don't think is an advantage. We have times where some banks will come in and say, banks that we currently don't work with, and say we can do better on a short-term interest rate market. If you move $50 or $100 million into our accounts, we can handle that amount of money. And we don't have that flexibility within our provisions right now. We would like that flexibility. In particular, bond underwriting firms, while there are not very many women or minority-owned bond underwriting firms here in the Twin Cities, there are nationally, and certainly when I worked as an advisor to larger entities, that was a requirement, was to have some MB or WMB representation. And I would also say that we do take seriously this idea that we can, in some cases, be more efficient by expanding our work as staff and to do some of the investments ourselves rather than hiring a third party, and we can benchmark ourselves against that third party. And certainly loans, I know that CPED and Andrea Brennan is exploring whether we should be, instead of outsourcing a fair amount of that loan servicing as well as underwriting, to just do that more with staff ourselves. And so there would certainly be policy issues we would bring before you as a city in the next several months to make some changes. I think if we were to move to option C, staff recommendation really would be to say that before we go out for any RFPs, we need to really define what is the fossil fuel industry. We need to determine what the weighting of these elements are in an RFP. Seattle, for example, has gone to socially responsible banking as 15% of the rating system for awarding a new contract when they get to that point. But I think it's not just a matter of the financial policies, but really the responsible banking ordinance that should tie together on whatever our priorities are. So our objective as staff is to move forward with option B for the reasons that I enumerated earlier. Certainly would welcome any feedback from elected officials on this particular issue. And again, I thank you for the patience that you had in this process of walking through this. And certainly I felt it was very beneficial for me to get a full understanding of what the city's banking relationships. There may have been one or two that I missed. Certainly would welcome anybody bringing those to our attention. But I also feel good about the fact that the city is making efforts on reducing our fossil fuel reliance over the long period of time. And my experience has been is that purposeful, kind of paced change is the best kind of change over a long period of time. But again, I'm not the one who makes the decisions. You as the elected officials are. So just giving you recommendations on on how we expect to move forward. Thank you, Chair. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Very good. Thank you very much, Mr. Ralph. It was a very complex and but thorough report. I appreciate that very much putting together. And it was in response to obviously something that came up through the budget process, but something the city's been considering for a number of years, as we just did the responsible banking ordinance. By the way, if you're complying with that as a vendor of, or as a vendor of the cities, or one who issues or responds to an RFP for future, you'd have to fill out the responsible banking ordinance questionnaire, and that's due in July 1st. So just in a matter of a week or two, we'll start to see the results back from the benefits of having the RBO in place, which really requires some transparency and seeing how banks or financial institutions are involved in local investments. So that's a big part of it. And we're going to continue to meet with community members and as other stakeholder organizations as we're continuing to refine our process, something that they were very involved in as we created the responsible banking ordinance, as well as shaping the RFPs, both for our banking services and our investment banking programs that happened in 2015. So we're going to continue those operations. So with that, happy to have comments from committee members, and please, Council Members Cano and Gordon, feel free to join us. Council Vice President Glidden has the first.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the report, Mr. Ruff. There's a lot in here, I will say. So it's really pretty dense report. I was the chief author of the Responsible Banking Ordinance, and when we were examining kind of what would be possible and kind of what were the options we were thinking about with the Responsible Banking Ordinance in, I guess that was 2013 when we worked on that. We did have a lot of conversation about what size of bank might be able to respond to requirements for servicing the city's accounts. But I will say, I never knew, even through all that conversation, that there was actually a Minnesota state law that's had this requirement for collateralization. So that actually was really helpful for me to understand. So I think in the community and even with policymakers, we weren't mistrusting, what we heard from finance staff, but I just think we didn't understand, was this a federal requirement? Just, where does this come from? And it's sort of interesting. Do other states have this collateralization requirement? I just, would like to understand it a little bit more, because it is part of the perhaps a protection for organizations like the City of Minneapolis, but it also makes it difficult for us to diversify the types of institutions that then can qualify to serve the City of Minneapolis, and sort of affects our interest that way too.
Mr. Chair, Council Vice President Glidden, other states do vary for collateralizations. I would say the majority of states have some form of a collateralization. The amount, so we have 110%, so we go above and beyond, right? Okay. Some states may only require 80 or 75%. They also may give more flexibility to banks as to what form of that collateral might be, so that we have certain minimum rating requirements. I think it's AA of some kind of letter of credit, so they may be able to lower that letter of credit as well. I think it is worth talking to the legislature again about these particular issues. The banking world, as we saw during the financial crisis, is very tied to the federal government, and different banks have different access to Federal Reserve and other types of securities. And so I think there is some opportunity for some change there, but we would need to really work in concert with key staff at not just in the legislature, but really in the governor's office, to make sure in the department, especially Department of Commerce, as to what comfort level they had of security that would be adequate.
Right. So thank you for bringing that up. I mean, I guess I will say I'm interested in exploring that, but certainly understand this is something where, experts who deal in these areas and sort of variety of folks need to be able to weigh in to help us understand, is this really the proper standard, 110%? I know there's other areas where we've been sometimes following a state standard where maybe it's not a state law requirement, and questions about whether the state is at the right amount, whether that's on insurance requirements and some other things that, again, are about the protection of the public, but then are they sort of evolving with the current standards of the time? I guess that's a little bit more of the question. And I say this because it relates to one of the items that was in your slides, which is about continuing to grow our relationships with financial institutions to try to ensure that we have a competitive environment responding to RFPs, knowing that you've laid out a whole number of different types of banking services that we could issue for RFP that aren't necessarily tied to the collateralization requirement. And maybe you could just say a little bit more about what you think in terms of either activities or time that you think would be beneficial to, I don't know if it's growing the relationship with some of those institutions or letting them know the city would, just think they were serious candidates if they had an appropriate proposal, or, what does it take to make sure that we have a good, anyway, it's
Sure.
variety of competitive applicants so we don't feel just tied into one or two all the time.
I would say, Mr. Chair, Council Vice President Glidden, it's one of the reasons why we want to expand the number of institutions we work with on the investment side, because for better or for worse, I think we don't hear from a lot of smaller banks in the finance area. I think clearly CPED and some of the programs they have more interaction, but there would be one more way of building relationships. Certainly, I'll use an example. Bremer Bank is a bank that oftentimes has come to us and say, we'd like to help you on some of the investments. There are others. After this news story hit in December, I certainly had other smaller banks that that called us, and either me or Lori Johnson talked with them specifically. But absent having a transaction or something to work on, we just don't have a chance to build those relationships. And I would say that my experience is as I said, again, as electronic as the world becomes, it still comes down to individual people relationships and the comfort level that we have, what kind of, because again, it's not just about their capacity, but what kind of customer service do they offer as well, which is equally as important to us as cost, I think. So to directly answer your question, I think by broadening the number of firms that we could work with on an investment basis would then help inform us who's interested in doing more work and willing to invest some of their own time and resources into making some of these changes, and that relationship could be built then and expanded.
So, and then I had one more question, and I know that there are a couple of motions that some of us have that we're hoping to put out there for discussion, but there may be other questions before we do that. So, but just my last more question was, you, one of your recommendations is that if we, and I gotta get the right slide here, but you recommend utilizing the responsible banking ordinance as an appropriate vehicle for, I guess, if we wanted to define certain terms that we hoped would influence best responsive candidates either for banking or other procurement services, you identified that you wish that we would use the responsible banking ordinance as a vehicle for some of those changes. And I just wanted you to say a little bit more about how you thought that ordinance could or should be changed. And I just say that because today we do have, I think, what's generally understood as a city priority or goal for supplier diversity. And yet there is nothing in the responsible banking ordinance about that goal other than we ask responsive vendors to describe to us certain activities that maybe fall into those categories, but that's just more informational. So we don't do anything with that. We don't give preferences or anything based on that information. So are you envisioning that we redesign the responsible banking ordinance to include definitions of procurement-related terms such as supplier diversity? Or how are you envisioning the changes to the responsible banking ordinance if the council did decide to go down that path of exploring other ways we can express our larger goals?
Mr. Chair, Council Vice President Glidden, I think there are two paths for the city to take. One would be more global change to procurement for all vendors. But if we want to choose to just focus more on the banking relationship, I was having a hard time because the responsible banking ordinance is not just an annual reporting requirement after someone gets hired, but it actually was also, as I understand it, and you too, you as those involved in creating this would know this better than me, but as I understand it, it's also a tool we use to evaluate during an RFP process potential vendors. And so that would be the place that we would put expectations or particular attributes that we are interested in. So I'll use again, the supply versus demand. So it's not just about how much in lending for fossil fuel industries or pipeline projects, but it's also how much lending do you do for renewable energy projects. Okay? So, and what kind of reporting in terms of trends? Is that an upward trend? Is that a declining trend? So those types of things I think help inform decisions on what type of vendors we may want to work with, and to also encourage them to alter behavior if that's what our desire is. So those are the types of, I think, consistent with what the last round of responsible banking ordinance was, which was a focus on what kind of mortgage lending do you undertake, what kind of small business lending. If there's another social lens that we want to undertake, we got to, I think, as explaining it to vendors when I'm the department head trying to do that, say, here are the things that we're going to measure you against, and if you fail to measure them, then it's not a punishment, then it's a missed expectation. Okay, because we've laid out the expectation and they haven't made the expectation. So that was the reason for the responsible banking ordinance change recommendation, was to say that we are laying out what are essentially the rules of the game, and then we are measuring you against those rules of the game in that relationship.
Okay. And then I know I said that was my last question, but now you just reminded me another question. So if we add these things in, do we yet have any opinion from our city attorney whether we could make those additions and not be feeling that we might be running afoul of kind of these lines around, are you a regulator of banks? So I know that was the issue that came up in the New York District Court case, and that we have an ordinance that is a bit different than what was the New York ordinance, but so I just wanted to raise that.
Again, I think we have to kind of together decide, are these preferences or are these, hard and fast, go, no go type of what would be the right term? Probably
Requirements or conditions.
Conditions would be a better term.
Yep.
Yes, thank you for that.
All right, sounds good.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's one of the things when we initially did responsible banking ordinance, and then we put together an RFP process. We intentionally broke up the contract. We made it a menu. We wanted lots of people. I know our treasurer at the time was active trying to find 19 different people to submit bids, and still we were receiving only the 3, and they were on for complete packages. So our intention was good. We wanted more diversity, supplier diversity. We wanted more competitive relationships for a better deal, but we also wanted to achieve some greater good. But the responsible banking ordinance in itself became a barrier, as we heard from people who submitted or didn't submit because of the tasks associated with complying. So it was just something to think about. And one thing we could always do, as Council Vice President just alluded to, we don't have to necessarily change the ordinance, but we could change the RFP evaluation criteria screen as we're making decisions down the road. So that doesn't require an ordinance introduction. So just a thought as a comment. Councilmember, is that you, Councilmember Gordon? Please, feel free.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I just wanted to make a couple comments maybe before there's any motions. I mostly just wanted to extend my gratitude to the finance staff. After making this staff direction, they took the time to come and meet, talk about what we were doing, working on continually. Actually, I was joined by finance staff when I met with the Assistant Commissioner of Commerce to talk about banking from the state level. I really appreciated that and having you there. That was excellent. And the thoroughness of this report gives us a lot of information I don't think we had before. I'm wondering and thinking maybe even people in finance discovered some new things that they weren't aware of as they were drilling into what's CPED doing and what are all these issues out there. And I think we've got a lot of great opportunities here. I also wanted to note that there was lots of interest from the community after we made this staff direction too. We were pulled into a big meeting with lots of interest groups. I know Jewish Community Action, MN 350, SEIU, I forget all the people that were there, but just to talk about it and look at it. And there was really kind of a coming together. Some people who were concerned about bank employees being whistleblowers and getting paid properly and treated right. Other people worried about investments in low-income communities and what kind of mortgage loans are going out. And then people worried about fossil fuel industries. We're all getting excited about this idea. Could we have more influence and democratic control of it? And lastly, I was surprised because I started getting contacted from national organizations about it. There's a National Public Banking Institute, little did I know, and there I am having the opportunity to interact with a city council member from Santa Fe talking about how they didn't only do one feasibility study, they did two, and now they've created a task force to kind of study the issue and take it to the next degree. So we're in some area here that there's a lot of interest around at this point in our city and probably in our country. And I appreciate the information that we have here, and hopefully we can take some next steps to make sense.
Good. Yeah. Yeah, that's what I thought it would be a good time to take steps, indeed, because there's not, I think this is just a receive and file, but you presented a recommendation, so I think we should probably move forward with that in some capacity, and I think we've had a number of conversations with finance, and thank you for participating and help us craft some, but I think there's some staff directions. And the first motion is one that I'm authoring, as well as Council Vice President Glidden, Gordon, and Cano. It's directing the city coordinator and finance director to work with the city attorney and the Department of Civil Rights director to develop and recommend a timeline and process for drafting a socially responsible procurement and contracting policy for all goods and services procured by the city, including banking services. This timeline and process should incorporate potential changes to the city's responsible banking ordinance with regular reporting to the council on banking services. So that's the language of the first motion. I think it speaks to the idea that this is not just about banking services, but we really need to look at it as a procurement system, and having the finance and city coordinator along with the city attorney and civil rights department working on that is a good step forward, and we're looking for that kind of comment. So if there's any comments, questions on that particular staff direction motion. I see a thumbs up from Councilmember Gordon, so I want the minutes to reflect the thumbs up, Ms. Armstrong. And Council Vice President Glidden.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And I'm not sure if you're also going to move option B. I kind of think with the staff direction, this is a little bit of sort of an option B plus. And it's really more or less, I think, teeing up the question of what would it mean to have socially responsible policy. And I think there are some good questions that honestly we need to answer about would we even be able to define that in a way that would be meaningful? And those are things that we would need to work out together with policymaker, input with our staff. So I am a little bit more in favor of thinking of this as a procurement policy, not as something that's just restricted to one particular type of services that we engage in, but as how we think about our systems as a whole. But I think, just to, again, be blunt about it, I think the challenge will be, are we able to define socially responsible policy in a way that actually is meaningful and legal? Yeah. So I think that is a little bit of the challenge, but I will say this is a topic where I've heard from a lot of constituents that just are very interested in what does that mean? How does that relate to kind of our public services and our public goods? And so I think that this is a good first step for us to take along this line.
Okay. Welcome other comments. I just, for formatting, are we talking about moving option B and then this being a staff direction as sub A?
I don't know what you discussed with Mr. Ruff, because, and I just say that because we did have 3 options presented to us, which implies to me that you're making a choice of an option to give direction to staff, but maybe that wasn't the intent.
Mr.
Mr.
Chair,
Ruff, how-
just to clarify, I think we were asked to bring back options in this report. In the end of the report, I think the idea was that we would be moving forward with option B unless the council wanted to take us in a different direction. So I think that was part of the benefit of this longer process, was for us to review all of our practices and come forward with what we saw as the city council's longer term overarching goals. But if also with the opportunity, then if you see that as inconsistent with what your understanding is, then we're more than happy to receive feedback. But I was not asking for a formal vote for today.
I see. I guess the staff direction at the budget time asked for options, and that's what was clearly done and detailed through slide 30. And then you've gone the extra step and made staff recommendation at slide 31. So I think I'd like to move this staff recommendation of pursuing option B, and then appending the staff direction that I just read as the first one as part of that recommendation moving forward. So that's just for that formality. Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you. I guess I wanted to add to my thumbs up, but I think there's some things in option B that are very exciting. They enhance supplier diversity, also continuing to expand our municipal banking options. I think those are things definitely worth pursuing. I also just wanted to point out that we do have some policy that kind of governs over our procurement and contracting. I think it was Councilmember Benson who helped draft and get approved an environmentally friendly purchasing and procurement policy. So it really helped guide us with that. And I think we'll find we have lots of discretion when we're actually buying some services and contracts, as long as it's fair and we're not discriminating against anybody. So I'm excited about this. I think it is a fairly big piece of work, so I really appreciate that we have the city coordinator's office, the city attorney, and civil rights working on it, and hopefully policymakers can be involved in crafting that policy, and maybe some advisory groups. I do think the one concern that I have is we have a lot of contracts that are potentially coming due in 2018, and I'm not sure how the timing is going to work with drafting a new policy to influence those potential RFPs that we could go out for. So that's something we'll hear back on. And
good.
Was there a date when we're expecting them to come back on this? It's pretty open-ended. It could easily be, I don't have the motion in front of me.
On the staff direction that I just read, there's no
Yes.
date on that particular one.
All right. Well,
there
so
is
we
one
should just,
on the second.
just to flag that. Sometimes when we don't put a date on it, it leads to a long wait. So, but I'm willing to help monitor that.
Well, rather than taking independent votes on things, if we could just move to the second item, Councilmember Glidden.
Sure, thanks. I will read the second staff direction, which is by myself, Councilmember Gordon, and Kano, and it's directing finance staff to return to the Ways and Means Committee by September 15th of this year with recommendations for a timeline and cost for completing a study of the feasibility of establishing a publicly owned banking operation, including a review of the intergovernmental financial, legal, and technological considerations in relation to establishing a public bank serving state, regional, or municipal interests, with consideration of different scopes of services, including a smaller operation to serve targeted needs. And so I think the intent here is that we would have a better understanding of what it would cost to do a feasibility study. And then we can make decisions from there as a council on whether or not the council wants to move forward on that or not. I think the idea here was that we would see kind of what would be that ballpark estimate before the end of the year, before we adopt our budget, although I will just note by this time the mayor will have already released her budget, which sometimes means it's a little bit harder because you're making choices of winners and losers on what the mayor has already tried to fund. So this may be something that would apply to this year if council members on this council agreed, or it may be something that would be taken into account for a future occasion. The other thing I'll just note is that I know there has been a bill at the legislature in recent past years about public bank. And while I don't know how many legislators are interested in this concept, I believe the legislator who did offer that was a House member, is still in the legislature. And so I think that is also just an area to explore a little bit more, is interest from those in the state legislature in potentially doing some feasibility work around what would it mean to offer more public banking features or have a publicly owned bank. So just to throw that out there as well as more just my own commentary. And that's it.
Good. Thank you very much. Further comments on Council Vice President's staff direction? Nothing? Okay. I think that's enough for us to move forward today. So I'd like to take a vote on the overall recommendation of option B, and then with the 2 staff directions as crafted. No other questions, comments on those? All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Those items carry. Thank you very much for the great amount of work that you have done, Mr. Ruff, and sorry about the more work you have to do, but it'll be worth doing. So thank you very much for that. Seeing no further business on this agenda, we are adjourned.